Hello students, as we were discussing problem of translation and we talked in the previous video the introduction part. Let's move forward. In translation, our today's topic, in problem of translation actually, our today's topic will be poetry in translation. Means we are going to deal with translation of poetry. What are the problems that we confront in translation of poems? Okay. Within the field of literary translation, more time has been devoted to investigating the problems of translating poetry than any other literary mode. What does it mean? We translate verses, we translate prose. In prose, we can translate a novel, a drama, a short story, a travelogue, memoir, all sort of genre that we have in prose. But there we have more accuracy than in the translation of poetry. So while talking of the problems of translation, when we'll have to talk of a single literary genre or form, we can focus first on the translation of poetry. The people have talked more on this. When I'll explain the whole video, the whole content in this video, you will understand that why this poetry translation is that much important. Suzanne Basnet, she talks with the reference of Andre Lefevre, Andrelevere. He catalogues 7 different methods employed by translators and discusses how different types confront different problems. So basically we are going to talk of those 7 different methods by which poetry is translated time to time by different translators. And in each type we will find that how that particular type affects the appropriate translation. How a particular problem is created in that particular type of method. Okay? The first one is phonemic translation. Phonemic, Phonemic. As you can relate it with phoneme, Phoneme. What is phoneme in linguistics? The smallest unit of sound. And what is the smallest unit of sound in a language that we can understand? I mean the meaningful smallest unit of sound, that is morpheme. Okay? So phonemic translation, what do we have in it? an attempt to reproduce the SL sound in the TL. SL means source language, TL means target language. So here the attempt is to reproduce the SL sound. So the focus is on sound, phoneme. Reproduce the SL sound in the TL while at the same time producing an acceptable paraphrase of the sense. Okay? So while translating the sound, the translator tries to create an acceptable paraphrase of the sense. Paraphrase, I hope you understand. When you go for the original content in the market, many the times you find the paraphrase. Suppose you have to buy some play, some drama by Shakespeare. When you go to the common shop, you don't find that in the original text. You find there the paraphrase of the play with the original one. Paraphrase in English. So in paraphrase, basically we understand how the things are translated in the same language in simpler way. But here we have paraphrase in another language. The paraphrase of source language text into the target language text. So the main focus is on sound with the creation of an acceptable paraphrase of the sense. This works moderately well. Means somehow, moderately means not very bad, not very good. Moderately well in the translation of onomatopoeia, that is the figurative device, figure of speech concerned with the particular sounds. So in translation of that particular figure of speech, this helps. But when we talk of the overall result, the overall result is devoid of sense altogether. So the complete translation doesn't make any sense. So what is the sense translating in that manner? When you are just following the sound, but the whole translation does not seem acceptable. So this is the drawback of phonemic translation of poetry. When you move to the second one, literal translation, you understand the difference between literal and literary. Literal means word to word. Literary means sense to sense. When you get just abhidha meaning in the phrase of Anandavardhana, when you go with abhidha, that is literal. When you go with vyanjana or the suggested meaning, that is literary. The superficial one and the deeper one. Okay? Literal translation. Here the emphasis is on word for word translation. You can think of any particular poem in Hindi being translated in English, and what are we doing while doing that? We are just putting the words of the similar meaning from the other language. Do you think that the poem of Hindi can be translated in English just by translating word to word, then what will happen? It distorts the sense and the syntax of the original. Sense, of course, when you go with word for word, you will not get the actual sense. As you know, poetry is not something that is there with the words only. And one more thing, when you go word for word translation, the great difficulty is with the phrases and idioms. Do you think that you can translate phrases and idioms just word by word? See, for example, in Hindi we have लोहे को लोहा काटता है. The translation of that idiom in English is diamond cuts diamond. Why do we have that translation? Because, as I told you earlier also, the language does not exist in independence. It carries the load of the culture. So when we deal with the language, we deal with the culture. We cannot ignore that. Why don't we have translations of the Hindi words like ghee, bhabhi, sari? Why don't we have? Because they are not considered that much in the English culture. Okay? So suppose if such words come, what will you do? See, for example, as I talked to you before you earlier also, that the novel of Premchand, that is known as Godan, is translated in English as the gift of cow. Do you think that this is the proper translation? When you go with word to word translation, do you get the meaning? The actual meaning? Do we understand dan and gift as same? Of course not. And this difference can only be understood by the person who is from the Hindi culture. So, when you go with literal translation of poems, you find it distorts the sense and the syntax of the original. Why syntax? Very simple. Syntax means what? The grammar of sentence. Simply, when you think of the most common structure of Hindi sentence, you find karta, karma, kriya. Means in Hindi, subject is followed by object, then by verb. What about English? What kind of syntax there you have? Subject, then verb, then object. So do you think what will happen when you go with word to word translation? Suppose in simple prose, you have a line, राम घर जाता है. राम घर जाता है. When you translate word to word, what will happen? Ram home goes. Is it correct one? Don't you think that you will lose all sort of meaning of English language? As if you are compelling English to behave like Hindi. Okay. The third method that he talks about is metrical translation. Metrical, you understand, meter. Very important in poetry. Meter and rhyme and rhythm and what or not. Where the dominant criterion is the reproduction of the SL meter. Criterion, you understand? Singular one. The plural one is criteria. The dominant criterion is the reproduction of the SL meter. So here the main focus is on the meter of source language. So the same meter of source language we want to translate it into target language. Like literal translation, it concentrates on one aspect of the SL text at the expense of the text as a whole. What does it mean? See, suppose we have to have the balanced diet in our food for becoming healthy, for remaining healthy. Okay? And for that, what are the things that we need? We need carbohydrate, protein, fat, vitamin, roughness, nutrients. What will happen when we just go for the single constituent of balanced diet? Suppose we are just thinking of the carbohydrate. In the name of food, you are just having rice or just chapatis or just vegetables or just pulses. What will happen? Do you think that you will remain healthy just by taking one kind of food? Of course not. You will have to take each of them in the proper proportion for remaining healthy. In a similar manner, when you go for just metrical translation, it means you are ignoring other sort of things, other sorts of importance. So it means we are focusing on one aspect and forgetting others, and ultimately on the expense of the whole, we are just trying to catch the single aspect, and that's problematic. Okay. The fourth one is poetry into prose. This results in distortion of sense, communicative value, and syntax of the SL text. When the poetry is translated into prose, is it justice with the poetry? You are reproducing those beautiful lines in a very harsh manner, in a very rough manner, making them as prose, making them as boring ones. This results in distortion of sense. So when a poetry is translated into prose, there we have distortion of sense. Why? Let me tell you. If we have 4 lines, we have 1 stanza poem. Do you think that the stanza 4 line in verse can be translated into 4 lines of prose? Do you think that translation of poetry into prose is acceptable, is formidable, is permissible? Of course not. Because see, generally when you do the explanation of the poetry in prose, you find that you are unable to do the explanation in just 4 lines, because you know that while explaining the text you need more words, because the poetry is written in a very compact way. Greater ideas are communicated just by the use of few words. Fifth one is rhymed translation, rhyming. So here we focus on meter as well as rhyme. In metrical translation, the more focus is on meter only. In a rhymed translation, the translator focuses on meter and rhyme. And what will happen? Which makes the product like nothing more than caricature. Caricature, you understand? When you portray someone, in a way, you are exaggerating a particular kind of behavior of the person. You are making that particular behavior or trait of the person as exaggerated. You are extending that, and in a way it becomes a funny character, a character by saying whom or her, we find it very different kind of thing, which creates a kind of laughter. Excess focus on a particular trait of a person is done, then the caricature is created. Okay? So excess focus on meter and rhyme while translating poetry makes it that much valuable. It's like caricature. Then the sixth one is blank verse. You know blank verse? There you have meter but not rhyme. Iambic pentameter lines. And why blank verse translation? Because blank verse is considered to be the most common meter used in prose as well as in poetry in English literature. So again, the restrictions imposed on the translator by the choice of a structure are emphasized. So when we follow blank verse, when we follow iambic pentameter, then also we have the restriction, and that restriction hampers the way of the translator. He has to emphasize on one aspect. Then the seventh one is interpretation. See, when you interpret poetry, when you give a single poem to 4 different students, you will find 4 different versions of them, 4 different explanations, and sometimes you find the limitations as well. Limitations means the interpretation is made limited in certain ways. So, while interpreting a particular source language text in target language text, by having versions and limitations, the translator produces a poem of his own which has only title and point of departure of if those in common with the source text. This is the problem. When the translator goes with the interpretation only, you will find that he is not actually translating the source language text. He is creating his own text in his language, in the target language. The only similarity that you find in source language text and target language text is the title and point of departure, if that is there. Okay? So that is not actually the translation. When one just rests on the interpretation. So these all sort of deficiencies that we have talked upon are due to an overemphasis of one or more elements of the poem at the expense of the whole. So this is the main thing that we have understood. When we focus on just one aspect and we are ignoring the other aspect, it means we are not making justice as translator in the context of poetry especially. The greatest problem when translating a text from a period remote in time is not only that the poet and his contemporaries are dead. See, suppose if a particular poem of 16th century is being translated in 20th century. In these 4 centuries, it's very clear that the poet is not alive and the people around him are not alive. But the significance of the poem in its context is dead too. This also happens with the simple kind of poems. You know the difference between a great work of art and simple work of art? Great work of art remains for all the ages. When you interpret them in different context, you will find them capable of communicating some meaning to you. But the simple work of art, they lose their meaning with the passage of time, and that's how we find great poets like Shakespeare. They talk of universal and eternal things, and that's why, see, for example, when we talk of the drama Hamlet, written in English in original in 16th century, but we find its transcreation as Heather movie in India in 21st century. A text of 16th century is being transcreated in 21st century with a different context, with the context of Kashmir. This is the trait of the great work of art. But obviously, this does not happen with all sort of poetry, with all sort of poems. They lose their meaning with the passage of time. So that is the problem. So what is there to be translated? See, while choosing a work of art for translation, we have certain ideas, certain notions, certain purpose. Why are we translating it? Is there any significance of translation, or just we are doing for the sake of the knowledge that we have of the source language and target language? If you know Hindi and English both, it doesn't mean that you should translate each and everything that you find. One has to be choosy, one has to be selective. Sometimes, as with pastoral, means pastoral elegy. Pastoral, for example, the genre is dead and no amount of fidelity to the original form, shape or tone will help the rebirth of a new line of communication. So the genre like pastoral elegy, when one tries to translate it, one finds that the translation is not of that much significance. The shape of the poetry or the tone of the poetry is not of the current importance. The verse translation rests on the axis point where types of interpretation intersect with types of imitation and derivation. Try to understand. While translating a verse text, one has to be aware of the interpretation as well as imitation and derivation. Moreover, a translator will continue to produce new versions of a given text. Obviously, as we talked in our previous video, translator as a reader. So as a reader, he interprets the text. So obviously, he will produce new versions. Not so much to reach an ideal perfect translation, but because each previous version, being context bound, is individualistic. See, this is there. You cannot ignore this fact. When one particular poem is being translated by 4 different people, you will find 4 different versions. So, because the main focus, see, the main focus of the translation is not just the creation of the same particular text of verse in other language, and that makes the importance of the translation. See, for example, when you talk of Srimad Bhagavad Gita, you will find its translation by different people in India, like Tilak and others. While reading the translation of Gita by different people, you will understand that one thing, that while translating Gita, they are communicating with us. Means that particular writer, that particular translator is communicating with us. As if, see, what do we understand by their Gita? When we read the original Gita, we find our own interpretation. And when we go with their translation, we go with their understanding of the text. So each individual understands the text in the individual way. So while reading the individual translations, we are dealing with the individual understanding, and that is bound to be done. That is almost inevitable. We cannot ignore it. We cannot escape it. We cannot escape it. We cannot be away from it. This is the thing that we have to understand. We have to keep in our mind. I hope now you have got much more idea. Thank you.